How's it going, guys? Today I thought I'd run through the startup of the Huey, just improve on some videos that I already have in slightly higher quality, and I also know a bit more about the Huey than I did a few years ago. So the startup for this thing is fairly simple. Um, this is, I think, a 1980s era Huey, so it's got a few instruments in it that wouldn't have been present maybe Vietnam era. Most notably, you have a radar altimeter here, which is very handy in IFR conditions. You know exactly how far you are above the ground, regardless of any air pressure changes. It's very accurate. This thing packs a much more powerful engine than those original Hueys would have, and I believe that the rotor blades themselves are made of like a modern composite as opposed to the metal blades that they would have had back then. The way a lot less, it's better for fuel efficiency. Right, so just a quick overview of the Huey before I start. So this is your UH-1, pretty iconic aircraft. It's one of my favorite helicopters of all time. It's very interesting. Um, it's developed maybe in the 50s and sort of started mass production in the 60s. And obviously it's made famous by the Vietnam War, um, where the dense jungle sort of prohibited any other style of warfare. Basically, you could not move troops en masse with tanks and APCs and trucks like you could in every other war. The Huey was a very much required for those conditions. So, much like its age suggests, the Huey has almost no computers in it at all. The only exception to that would be the sort of modern radar altimeter, probably has some circuitry behind it, but other than that, this thing is all analog. There's no digital computers, put it that way. There's no assistance at all other than hydraulic assistance. So the hydraulic assistance, once the pumps are running, will make it easier to manipulate the controls, but there's no stabilizing computers or anything like that, like you'd find in the Mi-8 or any other modern helicopter, really. More modern helicopter, I should say, because the Mi-8 is quite old in itself. So the Huey has a single gas turbine at the top. I believe it's made by Lycoming. So that single turbine turns both the main rotor blade at the top and the tail rotor blade down the bottom, and that's done through a drive shaft and multiple gearboxes. You can sort of see along the top of the tail, you can see the rib where the drive shaft would run down, basically. And any drag on the tail rotor, you'll see in probably the next video, any loading on the tail rotor contributes to the overall loading of the helicopter, meaning if you use your tail rotor more or less, you'll see a reduction or increase in available engine power. And this leads to some interesting flight effects, especially if you're low on power and you need it to lift a very heavy load. There's a few tricks I've read in books over the years that the Huey pilots in Vietnam would do is when they're loaded and they need to get over, let's say, a fence just to get some forward airspeed up, they'd throw in right pedal, which decreases the loading on the tail rotor, therefore gives you a slight increase in available power in your engine. Little tricks of the trade right there. So in addition to the main and tail rotors, it has a vertical stabilizer which helps stabilize the aircraft basically when you've got a bit of forward airspeed and the wind is blowing over it. You can see that it has an airfoil pointed in one direction. Um, so that helps a lot with forward flight. Basically means that you almost don't need to use your rudder pedals at all, like just slight trim maybe in forward flight, maybe at above 60 knots. When you drop below that threshold, though, that's when your vertical stabilizer starts losing efficiency and you need to start making corrections with your pedals. And you can see, I'll demonstrate here, as if you move the pedals, it changes the pitch of the tail rotor. In addition to that, we have a vertical stabilizer here, and if I pitch the cyclic forward and backwards, you see that actually plays a part in controlling the aircraft as well. And interestingly enough, that is actually an inverted airfoil, you can see. It provides a bit of downforce to keep the nose up. So with the main rotor assembly, you have these little counterweights here, which I'm not sure what the technical term is, but basically when they're spinning, they provide a almost gyroscope. Because it's connected to the rotor blades, it has the effect of wanting to stabilize the aircraft and bring it back to where it was before. In effect, it basically makes the helicopter a lot more stable to fly. It always wants to stabilize and correct itself. So as a quick overview on the controls, right in front of us here we have our cyclic stick, and that's named a cyclic stick because it changes the pitch of the blades. As you can see, the blades change as I move the stick, uh, and they change the pitch of the blades in various stages of its cycle in a complete 360 turn. So this blade, there's two blades on the Huey, but it's better to think of this as once it starts spinning, it's a big disc rather than two blades. So that rotor disc tilts in relation to where your cyclic stick is pointing. So if I tilt my stick forward, the rotor disc tilts forward. If I tilt back, it tilts back, and so on and so forth. The exact mechanics of how that works is a very interesting physics lesson. I can maybe attempt to explain it here. But basically, due to gyroscopic precession, if you make a change to the rotor blade in one part of its journey, let's say if we're considering this north, or 0 degrees is at the top and 180 degrees down the bottom, if the blade down the bottom makes a change, let's say it pitches up, then the resultant effect of that, the force that's enacted on the rotor disc and the helicopter itself, doesn't happen until 90 degrees into its travel. Now this thing rotates from the view that you're looking now anti-clockwise. So interestingly enough, for me to tilt this blade up and down here in this, and both of them are doing it in the north and south sector. Interestingly enough, to do that, I'm actually pushing the stick left and right, and that actually correlates to left and right roll. So if you want to roll the helicopter to the left, I'm going to hold the stick there. The rear blade pitches up, it bites more so into the air, and then the extra lift it produces doesn't take full effect until it gets to the right side of the helicopter, the east position, which has the resultant effect of rolling the whole helicopter to the left, and vice versa. So if I move the cyclic stick to the right, the south blade, it rather than pointing down, I'd say that neutralizes, and the north blade is now the one that is pitching up, and that one will rotate through to the left side of the helicopter, or the west side, and there'll be a sort of dissymmetry of lift. It'll lift up on the left side and roll the helicopter to the right. So left and right roll, the blades are pitched in this direction, or in the north and south position. And then the interesting thing is, if I want to pitch the helicopter back and forwards, I'm just going to keep rocking that cyclic stick. There's no movement at all on either side, actually. So I'm pitching forward and backwards. You can see the horizontal stabilizer moving. So again, this rotor disc rotates counterclockwise. And so if I wanted to push the cyclic stick to the rear, when the blade hits the east position, it will tilt up or pitch up. And then when it hits the north position, that's when the resultant force enacts on the helicopter, and it raises the nose and pitches the helicopter backwards, just like the stick. So in summary, the direction of the cyclic stick is directly correlated to where you are tilting the rotor disc itself. So tilting forward will tilt the discs forward, and you'll tilt forward, tilt backwards, left and right, which is very simple to imagine, but on a technical level, and for reasons due to more advanced physics, basically, the actual movement of the blades is 90 degrees out of sync with the cyclic stick. All right, our next control is the collective. So the collective collectively pitches all the blades up, regardless of where it is in its rotation, basically. Whereas the cyclic only rotates the blades in different stages of its cycle, hence why it's called cyclic. The collective does them regardless of where they are in their stage of rotation. So the blade pitches and bites more air, and the whole rotor disc does that all the way around, basically. So I'll go outside. So you can see here, if I raise the collective, both blades bite more air, and that will generate a lot more lift, basically. It also has the side effect of creating a lot more drag on the rotor disc, so the rotor disc will actually slow down. So even though you're producing more lift and you're climbing, the rotor disc itself slows down, and so we have a throttle just here. get that going. So here's your throttle. So it's like a motorbike throttle, and that basically changes the engine RPM. In older helicopters, you had to manage this. So if you raise the collective up to start climbing, your engine RPM and rotor RPM, which are mostly tied together, they should always be tied together, the engine and rotor RPM will start dropping. If you slow the engine down or slow the rotor down too much, it'll stall out. So you want to, while you're increasing the collective, increase the throttle. In more modern helicopters, the throttle itself is now governed by what they call a governor. Here's your governor switch here, so you can have the governor on, or you can turn it off in emergency conditions. And that basically will automatically govern or manage your RPM for you. And you want it to always be in this colored range here. So you have your rotor RPM on the inside and your engine RPM on the outside. There's two needles there, and they should basically always be together. So that's your collective there. That's your up and down movement, or your climbing and sinking. In addition to that, on the same control, you have your throttle, motorbike twist throttle, basically. Last controls are your rudder pedals, and I demonstrated these before. Basically, you push the rudder, and that will yaw the helicopter left and right, and they basically directly affect the pitch of the tail rotor blades. You can see here. It's just a miniature version of the rotor, and it's just pushing off to one side. So now, because the main rotor rotates in an anti-clockwise direction, or if I'm sitting here in the cockpit looking up that blade, when I start this engine, those blades will start pushing off to the left. The main rotor turns anti-clockwise, which has the resultant effect of pushing the body of the aircraft in the opposite direction. So from my perspective here in the cockpit, the nose will swing off to the right. And that's thanks to Mr. Newton's third law. Basically, it's every action has an equal and opposite reaction. So if the rotor blade turns left, the resultant torque pushes the body of the aircraft to the right. And if we didn't have a tail rotor, we wouldn't go anywhere. So we have a tail rotor here, which forces air to the left of the aircraft. It pushes it that way. And what that does is, because that's on the tail and the pivot points around the rotor mast, it pushes the nose to the left. It corrects for that torque movement. And it's not perfect because it's sort of most of the way there, but you have to fine tune it with the pedals basically. So if you are sitting on the tarmac with low power, you basically don't need to do anything at all. As you increase the collective to start climbing into the air, the torque increases. And if you don't correct it, you'll start drifting off to the right. So you need to start adding more and more left pedal to correct for that, to keep your nose straight. So your takeoff, I'll explain this in the next video, the takeoff position basically is as you raise the collective, you're only pushing in that left pedal, and it's sort of, it's correlated with how much you raise the collective. There's not a sort of a fixed amount. So it's, and it'll differ based on the loading of your helicopter and how much power you're demanding of the engine. So you sort of get a feel for it over time. But basically, whenever you're moving these, it'll be 1-to-1 left pedal, raise the collective. And then also when you are descending and you're in the air, it's actually the exact opposite. You lower the collective, you start sinking. Now you have air pushing up through your rotor. It's actually the opposite effect. You need to actually put right pedal in while you're descending. Otherwise, your nose starts pushing off to the left. So I guess you can think of these, they've got like a seesaw arrangement. So meaning if I just push the right pedal in, the left pedal comes back, and vice versa. I don't have to push on both. You can't push on both simultaneously. And that's probably the best way to think about your pedals. It's a seesaw, and you're constantly balancing the helicopter in the your axes, the left and right movement. You're constantly balancing that, and that'll constantly change based on what these other two controls are doing. So just as a general overview of the cockpit itself, we have our ADI ball, which is our artificial horizon. I tend not to use this too much because in a helicopter you want to be looking out of the cockpit and at the actual horizon. And really that'd be there for IFR or non-visual conditions. It's too foggy or it's nighttime or something you can't see. That's what you would use that for. It's just because when you're flying in an actual helicopter, you really can't feel the orientation of the helicopter. If you didn't have this ADI ball and it was IFR conditions outside, you would have absolutely no idea if you're rolling to the right, left, up, down. You have no idea at all. So you sort of, that there is just a nice reference point to use, but I don't use it when I can use the actual horizon outside the cockpit. Here we have our altitude in thousands of feet. So the fatter but smaller, shorter arm is thousands, so when it's pointing at the 1,000 feet, 2,000 feet, 3,000 feet, etc. And the smaller arm is hundreds of feet. So if it was, right now it's 0, but if the small arm had been pointing at the 4 and the long arm at the 2, that's 4,200 feet. Here's our VSI, which is our vertical sync rate. When it's pointing at 0, we're neither climbing nor descending. And then this is measured in thousands of feet per minute. So if you're pointing at the -1 down here, you are descending at 1,000 feet per minute, and vice versa for climbing. This is our HSI, or heading indicator, and it's got our compass, and it's got some interesting little tools where you can set like headings and that sort of thing. And also you have this needle which is tied up with your ADF rescue beacon. You can sort of home in on certain rescue beacons. Let's say you're doing a search and rescue mission. Below that we have another navigational tool down here. I don't recall what that one's called. I think it's just your VHF. Where is it? Here you go, your VHF radio. So you can use this as a beacon, I guess, and home in on a certain radio frequency. In this particular case, it's 30 FM, and these little crosshairs will sort of point towards where you need to go. I'll explain that in a future video. You've got a clock down here, very good for keeping mission time, and it's probably your main fuel gauge. If you know the rate of fuel burn per hour, it's probably more reliable than most actual fuel gauges are, which is located, where is that? Here, that's your fuel gauge there. I would trust the clock more than I would trust the fuel gauge. You got a backup magnetic compass here. So the compass on the HSI is powered by, I believe, the AC bus, which means when the helicopter is off, it's not on. And as you can see, if they've rolled the helicopter around and moved it around, it won't line up with reality anymore. So it's pointing north to the 12 o'clock position here. And obviously we're not pointing north, we're pointing closer to south. And so when you start the helicopter up, one of the things you're going to do is you've got to adjust that to what this says here, where your actual heading is. Continuing on, here's our airspeed indicator, which is measured in knots. And then you're given sort of a maximum speed of about 125 knots in the Huey. And beyond that speed, your helicopter's basically overstressing. But in addition to that, you have some very curious aerodynamic effects, which pitch your nose up and roll you off to one side, and you will fall out of the sky. Don't cross that line. So we've got our slip indicator here. So we've gone over the rotor and engine RPM. This is a very important dial here. You'll get a low RPM warning when you drop out of this optimal zone here. And also you'll get the same warning when you overspeed the rotor as well, which you'll sort of see when you try to auto-rotate. So we've got engine oil pressure. We've got temperature, RPM of the gas producer. And exhaust temperature here. So this one's an interesting one to watch when you're starting up, because there's no airflow, the jet turbine isn't at full speed, nothing's being cooled, it's not being cooled efficiently. So when you start, the startup range for the temperature, and this is hundreds of degrees, is between 600 degrees and 800 degrees. So when you start, you're sort of watching this needle, it'll go into this too hot range. And if it stays there and doesn't descend back into the nominal range after 40 seconds, that's when you abort the startup because something's gone wrong. This is definitely much too hot for the engine. It's only rated to sit in this temperature range for a certain number of minutes. With our radar altimeter here, very useful. You can set a alarm bug. That's your high alarm, and then your low alarm is, I think it's under, oh there it is. There's your low alarm there. So you can have a warning come up when you descend below that preset altitude, and you can have a height alarm as well. It's very useful. So we've got fuel pressure, fuel quantity, engine oil temperature. So again, most of these dials, they mark sort of your limits and your nominal ranges. You got your 100°C maximum temperature here. So we've got engine oil pressure. We've also got the transmission oil pressure, so the gearbox itself, and the temperature correlated with those. So there's your transmission oil temperature and your engine oil temperature. This is electrical data down here. So you've got current load for both the main generator and standby generator, and then you've got your voltages that they're running out, DC and AC. And then on the co-pilot side, we have pretty much mirror images of what you see on the pilot side of the main gauges, really the most important ones being your airspeed, your altitude, your vertical speed, and your HSI. All right, let's perform a cold start. So very first thing you want to do is we'll go up to this main panel up here, just ensure all of our circuit breakers are pushed in, which they are. for all systems. Let's come up here to the electrical panel, the overhead panel, and we're wanting to turn the inverter on turn the main inverter on. Turn the two multimeters to monitor AC phase on the AC bus, and the essential equipment or the essential bus for the DC line. We'll turn the main generator on. It won't actually turn on until we turn the battery on. We'll leave the starter generator on start. So as soon as I put the master power on, or the battery on, the low RPM alarm is going to sound, and it's doing its job and telling us that the rotor RPM is too low, which is fair enough because it's not moving right now. So it's very noisy. You can silence it with this switch down here, which doesn't apply until the alarm is actually sounding. So we'll turn that on. Alright. Next up, you can turn the fuel pump on. And you see now we have fuel pressure and fuel quantity showing. The very next thing to do is to start the engine. There's a trigger just underneath the collected head, and you pull that trigger to start the engine. You can't see it from here, but I have it mapped on my joystick. You want to give the throttle a bit of a prime, so we'll throttle up to maximum and then back down, and there's a sort of idle stop. We're stopping just there. Alright, so we're going to hold the trigger in, which starts the igniter, which lights the fire in the turbine. We're going to monitor a couple of things. First of all, we monitor the start time. In 40 seconds, the rotor RPM should stabilize at about 40%. And the exhaust temperature should not sit in the starting range, or the too hot range, for any longer than either of those two conditions. Go right ahead. See a voltage drop as we send power to the starter motor. Notice the rotor blade starts turning. The exhaust temperature is not doing too bad. It's only been about 15 seconds, and the rotor RPM is already stabilizing. It's good. Alrighty, we'll throttle the engine up very slowly, and we're monitoring the rotor and engine RPM. They should stabilize. The governor should take over when we get to about 80% throttle. It should take over and stabilize the RPM in this nominal range. So up we go. Alright, the governor's kicked in and stopped the engine, and rotor over RPM over speed. So we're good. Everything's working fine. Down here, we'll turn the force trim on and turn the hydraulics on. And for military reasons, we'll turn the IFM on to manage Alright, so right now we don't have any weapon hardpoints. We don't have to bother with any arming of weapons. We have countermeasures here, so we can set that up to maybe 2 flares, 2 shaft, and armor system. Dispense, that's the button there. Go ahead and turn the radar altimeter on. This is power switch here behind the circuit breakers. And then we set the low altitude knob, which turns the radar to it, so we'll set it at 500 feet. The HSI needs to be set, so we can adjust it using this knob here to 170 degrees. And for personal preference, we can turn on the instrument dial lighting. We have our master caution, which is still glowing from the low RPM alarm we got before. So we're going to go ahead and reset that. And while we're there looking at that switch there, if you push the switch in the other direction, you can test all the warning lamps to make sure that you light correct. At this point, you can set any VHF channels that you might need, radio channels you could need. Up top, we can put our starter generator on standby, and we can turn our anti-collision lights on. And the external lights we can have on, flash navigation lights. There you have it, that should be everything. We started UH1H